TPCC committee members, please call out present or here or whatever you would like to when I read your name. So Myrta.
Present.
And I'm assuming, Jordan, you're proxy for the mayor. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, that's Jordan Hess. Don MacArthur.
Here.
Ryan Hammond.
I am here.
And you're proxy for Lucia?
Indeed.
Okay. Commissioner Slotnick.
I'm here.
Welcome. And I am here. This is Dave Strohmeyer. I am serving as chair. Bob Vosen.
I am here.
Okay, he is here. Shane Morrissey.
Present.
Debbie Johnston.
Present.
Okay, excellent. Well, welcome everyone. We do have minutes to approve from March 16th. Are there any corrections or additions to those minutes? Okay, seeing none, they will be stand approved as entered into the record. Any public comment on non-agenda items today? Any public comment or any comment from anyone? Okay, seeing none, we are moving right along. We have two items of new business today, the long-range transportation plan and a related item that pertains to air quality conformity. So let's just kick things off. Aaron or Jennifer, do you want to lead us through our LRTP discussion?
Yeah, well, I'll kind of get us started and then hand it over to Jennifer to start the presentation, but just wanted to let you all know that we're nearing the end of this plan. And so I think this will be our last long range plan update before you see a draft plan next month. And so we're quickly wrapping up here and heading into the finish line on this project, which is kind of exciting. It feels kind of simultaneously really fast, but also like a really long year of working on the long range plan with COVID and all of the other things that have been happening this year. So, but the upside to that is that we've had the luxury of having Jennifer here with us just about every month, giving regular updates, which I think we would not normally have without having COVID in these sort of virtual meetings. So I think in that sense, this has been sort of silver lining to the COVID that we've had this year. So this presentation, we have some kind of final updates related to our recommended project list. And Jennifer, remind me what else is on the agenda for this one today. Primarily it's focused on the project list and then some
funding. We're going to talk about money.
Right, talk a little bit about funding and the financial aspect of our plan. And then some next steps as we round out the draft plan over the next couple of weeks. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jennifer, to kick off the presentation.
I will go ahead and share my screen. So yeah, thank you, Aaron, and good to see you all again. As Aaron mentioned, we are coming rapidly to the end of drafting the public review draft of the long range plan. And our hope in having provided these monthly updates as we've gone through is that when you see the draft plan next week, next month, there won't be anything in there that is a huge surprise to you. You've been part of helping to shape the ways that we have established goals, the ways that we have evaluated projects, shaped our scenarios, and now moved into having the draft recommended scenario. So hopefully today's presentation is sort of the cap on all of that as we think about how we prioritize within the recommended scenario. And then really, there's one key area that we would love your feedback on today, in addition to the recommended scenario, and that is around some of the funding options that we might introduce in the plan. Not that these are all options that are available in the state of Montana, and not that they are options that you as the coordinating committee would be interested in considering, but we do want to get a little feedback about what you feel comfortable with us including. So that is really our biggest topic. So since we saw you a month ago, I believe, let's see, in late March, we were in the midst of our last round of public engagement before, of course, we head into the public review of the draft. And what we were doing at that point was taking the recommended scenario out to the community, getting people's feedback on how well that recommended scenario is meeting their needs, and then also introducing for people a little bit of discussion around some of the programs and policies that will show up in the long range plan that can help to support the capital investments that will be made. So we had an online survey and got some good feedback through that. We hosted 2 open houses and virtual open houses, and we also attended the planning board meeting. And in those conversations, we heard from people that generally they felt like the recommended scenario was moving in the right direction, that we had done a pretty good job of capturing the region's transportation needs, and then also people's individual needs. So the graphic here on this screen is a screenshot from one of the meetings when we had people doing a little bit of live polling to tell us how well they thought the recommended scenario was doing. So that is a piece that we have wrapped up and incorporated that feedback into what we're going to share with you today. We also met with TTAC at the very beginning of this month and got some great feedback from them about the priorities that we'd set within the recommended scenario and have incorporated some of that into what we'll share with you today. So just as a quick reminder, this is a map of the recommended scenario that we shared with you last month and that we have continued to refine. So one of the important things is that in the last month, we haven't done anything crazy and added a whole bunch of projects to the recommended scenario or gotten rid of a whole bunch of projects. There are a few that have moved from the recommended list to the illustrative list, in part because of funding constraints that we've applied. And I'll be sure to highlight those as we go through, just so you've got really full transparency into what has changed. But just as a reminder, what we tried to do with this recommended scenario and what we feel like we continue to try and do as we prioritize the projects within it is really focus on the ways that the investments you make over the next 30 years can help to direct growth in a very strategic way. So with a little bit more of an inward focus, and to really focus on ways that we are maximizing and leveraging the investments that you're already making as a region. And so again, a couple of ways that we look at doing that are focusing on connections that we're making in what was formerly called the Mullen area, and the ways that we are really connecting that into downtown, the ways that we are advancing the active transportation and the neighborhood greenway network to connect the Invest Health neighborhoods and to really focus on some key regional connections. And also the ways that we are building new complete streets and new roadway connections that help to make some really important connections for people driving, people taking the bus, people walking and biking across the region. And those include the Highway 200 and Broadway Complete Street project, the Howard Razor Avenue Complete Street, and the new Johnson Street connection, which are all really important as we think about expanding that network and providing options for people no matter how they're traveling. So again, it is a blended scenario. It is one that pulls in elements from the new connections, the enhanced connections, and regional equity scenarios, and focuses on providing improvements for people no matter how they're traveling and really throughout the region. So with that recommended scenario, the next step that we had to take then was starting to program the projects in that recommended scenario into different time periods. And there are a handful of important things that Aaron and I want to make sure that we share with you, just so you can understand the ways that we are allocating dollars and then the ways that projects are being distributed across these time periods. So the first element of this is that when we talk about our near term, our medium term, and our long term time periods, you can see that we've focused in on the first 5 years of the plan. So this will essentially cover your next transportation improvement program, and blend a little bit into past those next 4 years. The medium term focuses on 10 years beyond that, so 2026 to 2035. And then for the long term, we've identified the last 15 years of the plan horizon. Part of the reason for doing that is there is just a lot more certainty around the near term, both in terms of projects that do need to move forward and also funding that is likely to be available. And then of course, the further and further out we get, the less certain funding availability and resources become. We have also then identified what we think the funding available is in each of those timeframes. And one important assumption that we made in doing this is that we have assumed that the local option fuel tax is repealed. And the reason that we made that assumption is simply to ensure that we are being as conservative as possible. It may be that that is not the case. And what that would mean is that you have a little over $8 million in additional discretionary funds. And so that's these funds that are available that you could use.
And Jennifer, could I just add one thing
course.
related to that I think is important on the local option fuel tax, that 8.2 million that we're showing here is just what we had assumed would be available for capital improvement projects. It does not include the amount of the local option fuel tax that was going to things like roadway maintenance or sort of non-project related expenses. And so that 8.2 million over 30 years does not include all of the local option fuel tax that would go to roadway maintenance, things like pavement preservation or other operational type aspects. And I think that's important to note on just sort of the impact of losing the local option fuel tax.
Mhm. Thank you for adding that, Aaron. It is a much bigger impact than just 8 million over 30 years when you think about the full scope. The other important piece that we did in thinking about the allocations of dollars by time period was also establishing what we wanted to use in terms of cost inflation for the projects that are part of the recommended scenario. And I won't go into a tremendous amount of detail on this, but essentially we use the midpoint of each of the time periods to inflate project costs. And the reason for doing that is just to balance out some of the uncertainty, to not have too much inflation that we're showing, but to be realistic as well. We also don't know exactly what year a lot of projects would move forward. For the near term, it's a little bit easier, but certainly as we get out to the medium and long term, it becomes fuzzier. I think one other important note to make, and Aaron, you should chime in on this as well, is that when we look at this funding availability, this is again based on what we assume to be the discretionary funds. And we talked through those various sources with you a couple months ago. It is possible that there could be more that gets done in any of these time periods if MDT is able to commit further federal funds. So that would be the statewide allocation to the Missoula district. There's also an opportunity, of course, for a big infusion of federal funds. The next infrastructure bill is being talked about as one that is pretty significant. The grant programs that are coming out of this administration look to be really promising as well. So there may be other opportunities here. But Aaron, anything you want to say about the state allocation piece of that?
No, just that those funds are, as we've talked a lot about, those get programmed at a statewide or MDT district level, which isn't to say that they won't potentially get invested in some of these projects or be a way to contribute to advancing some of these, but that there are a whole host of other needs throughout the district and throughout the state. And so we didn't assume that those would be available to program for our local priority projects. And I guess just with saying that, the way that often happens is something like Russell Street, where we had this large project where we needed additional funding to get that done in a way that was going to be efficient and within any reasonable time frame. And the state was able to bring $31 million of NH funds to that project. And so that's an example of where those statewide funds, federal funds, are really critical for helping to get those larger projects done. We just can't always anticipate that would be available, and so we don't necessarily want to commit to saying that they would be invested in any of these sort of our local priority projects.
Aaron, or Jennifer, for that matter, since you mentioned the gift that keeps on giving by way of Russell Street, the $36 million listed here as funding available. Is that inclusive of what is already committed for Russell, or above and beyond that?
It's above and beyond the committed projects like Russell Street.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay. So then, as we establish the amount of funding that is available in each of these time periods, we took our recommended list and went through a handful of steps to start to identify which projects need to fit in which time periods. So the first piece, and Dave, this ties a little bit to the question that you just asked, was that for our committed projects, those that are in the Transportation Improvement Program or the city or county's capital improvement program, those have been identified as committed throughout our planning process, but each of them, or many of them at least, do have portions that are unfunded. So we first identified what is the portion of those committed projects that needs to be funded through the LRTP discretionary funds. The next thing that we did was continue to refine a few of the project descriptions and costs. So this body recently approved the Highway 200 final plan, which had new cost estimates and more refined cost estimates than what we'd used before. So we plugged those in. We also broke that project into a handful of pieces. You can see Aaron's great sketch here as we were doing that to make sure that we could program different pieces of the project a little bit differently. Then we rescored all the projects again. So we went back to that same scoring approach that we used to evaluate the projects in the first place to make sure that we were advancing the equity and safety priorities that had been identified. And then the last thing that we did was really look carefully at other funds that need to be used within a particular period of time. And so the TIF funds, or the funds that are programmed by MRA, are a really important piece of that. There are funds that have to be used within the near term, and we needed to make sure that we had the right projects programmed in the near term to receive those funds. So those were the steps that we went through as we continued prioritizing. I believe that Aaron shared with you an updated list of the priorities for the recommended scenario. And there is an important change to this from what was shared with you last week, and that is to incorporate feedback from the Technical Advisory Committee. And one of those changes was that we elevated South Avenue, the South Avenue Complete Street and Shared Use Path. That moved into the near term. And instead, we shifted a couple of projects, one being the Bitterroot Bridge, and then we also shifted a couple of greenways into the medium term. And again, this was about really being able to advance a priority project. The other thing that I've highlighted here is, for example, the Front Main two-way conversion. So a really high priority project for the region, one included in the downtown master plan. There obviously has just been an engineering team that has been hired to help take the next steps with this project. And so we want to make sure that, of course, funding is available in the near term. And that's an example of making sure that the TIF funding is programmed in the right ways. So as you look at the near term, there's a couple things that I think are worth noting. You'll see, again, the committed projects that really jump right to the top there, and that is the portion of those committed projects that needs to be funded through these discretionary funds. So certainly Russell Street shows up on the list, a few of the build projects that have a little bit of funding that is needed, and then some that just show up with a zero, but that we wanted to make sure are captured as near-term projects. Those committed projects do take the vast majority of the funding that is available in the near term. Those two key exceptions are the ones I highlighted, Front and Main and the South Avenue Complete Street. Those are the other big dollar projects that we are able to fit within the near-term funding. And then we filled in the extra essentially with a good number of neighborhood greenways, and then with some lower cost improvements, a handful of bike lane improvements and an intersection improvement. So I won't walk you through all of the projects that are included in each term, but we did really want to highlight the near term just because this is the place where many of the toughest decisions need to be made. And we did go back again to the scoring, think really carefully about the priorities to make sure that we were advancing those that really were most important. Maybe one other note that I would mention here, there are so many really good projects that are included in the long range plan. You know, the Highway 200 project is one that is, of course, a regional priority. It's just a project that it's going to take a little bit longer to get enough funding available. And so that is one that falls in the midterm. The Brooks Corridor is another that is a very high priority project. It's one that is important to people. It's one that is important for the region, but it is an expensive project. And so that one is showing as a long-term project right now because grants are going to be needed, other funding sources are going to be needed, and that is one that is just going to take a while to have the right resources available. So those are just a few that I would point out. Erin, are there others that you want to mention specifically here?
I don't think so. Maybe just to reiterate that this is sort of our conservative funding outlook, and that idea of additions projects like Brooks, where we're going to need grant funding. Hopefully we'll be successful on a number of those, or with an infrastructure bill or other stimulus funding, that if we can advance those projects earlier, it frees up that long-term funding outlook in this sort of conservative view for other projects that we'll be able to. So this is, if we don't get any additional funding, this is how we would fund projects. And so some of those larger, more expensive ones that go to mid and long term aren't necessarily lower priority. We can't fund them earlier unless we get those grant funds. And so I think that's an important distinction here as we think about our project lists and how we actually get some of these projects done.
Great. So I'll just mention a couple other quick things and then pause for some discussion before we move on to funding. As I mentioned earlier, there were a few projects that, with a closer look at the revenues, we simply couldn't fit within the recommended list. And so we wanted to just make sure that everybody's aware of what those were. You'll see that 2 of these do have asterisks next to them, and those are projects that do need to remain on the illustrative list, even if the local option fuel tax is not repealed and if those funds are available. But a few that we did need to move from recommended to illustrative include the North Reserve and Scott Street, the I-90 trail connection, the Mullen Road shared use path. Scott Street, we now have advanced that one. So sorry about that. I forgot to make a change. And then the 3rd Street bike and pedestrian facilities. I do want to note that the Milwaukee Trail extension is not the river crossing. That's important because we've made a name change there. But these are a handful of the projects that then needed to move to the illustrative list. So they will remain within the plan, but just did not fit within the funding available. The last thing that we did is kind of just a check here. We took a look at the projects in the different time periods that we established, just to sort of see the spread of projects across the region. And this just zooms in really to the heart of Missoula. But the projects that are shown in green are those that would be advanced in the near term, so in the first 5 years. The yellow projects are the medium term, and then the red projects are the longer term. And so this is kind of a helpful way for us to just do a little bit of a check and understand where projects are likely to unfold. We also, with so many greenways that we were able to fit in the near-term projects, we want to make sure that we are continuing to build out a network and make connections for people, and not just having, one piece that is advanced on one side of the region and another that is advanced on another part of the region. So that was just a little back check we did as well. So before we go on to funding, let me pause there and see if there are questions or comments about the recommended list and what we've programmed in the near, medium, or long term.
Any questions from folks or comments? Okay, proceed, Jennifer.
Okay, great. Erin, do you want to talk about our funding buckets and our current sources, and then I'll take the outlandish ones?
Yeah, and so this is maybe a little little bit of a review for folks here, but just thinking about what funding we have available. Within our fiscally constrained plan, we have projected revenues of about a little over $1.3 billion, and that includes all of our maintenance funding, our capital improvement projects, our federal, state, and local funds. It includes transit. Sort of the full range of all of the money that we anticipate coming in for transportation, at least, that's reasonably easy, or, reasonable for us to calculate. There may be some other funds that are just hard, like general fund investments that shift from year to year that we maybe haven't captured here, but these are all the dedicated transportation funding sources. As we've talked about, there's sort of been a shift over the decades of federal funding down to local. And so about 50% of that Projected revenue is federal, and that's about $22 million a year. And then the other impact is the potential repeal of the local option fuel tax is just further constraining our available revenue. But we wanted to take a conservative approach, knowing that there's some uncertainty, and we didn't want to be, making that decision last minute as we're drafting this plan. But if there is any certainty around that, we can certainly update the plan in the next week or two. So our existing potential funding sources that we have available to us. We've talked about a lot of these throughout the project. There are federal and state grants. So we know things like build grants are potentially coming. There was just a notice of funding opportunity for another round. It's now been rebranded as RAISE, and I don't know that acronym yet. I need to learn a new one. But those funds continue to be available, and we have been successful as a region. We have an infrastructure bill being developed in Congress. We have stimulus or the economic recovery funds coming into the state that all potentially could add to our projected revenue. We also have our urban renewal districts and tax increment financing. That is a really important tool, and I think we've highlighted that a number of times throughout this plan. That there, we've done a lot of really good work with TIF funding over the years, and I think we'll continue to do that. And there may be some uncertainty that we may have additional TIF funds available depending on how those districts grow or what their priorities are for investing. We've tried to take an estimate of what's been invested over the last 5 or 10 years and project that forward, but it could be that there are much larger investments and so some additional TIF funds that could come up. And then some of the other standard ways that we can increase our revenue are things like special improvement districts to do targeted improvements within a neighborhood or a region. Development fees, we have impact fees at the city, and I know the county is working on an impact fee study right now, and so that we haven't considered that in our revenue projections today, and so that's another way to sort of increase the size of the pie, if you will. And then things like property taxes, bond measures, or even getting more creative, things like parking fees and using those parking fees to invest in specific infrastructure improvements. And that's something that I think a lot of other places are thinking creatively about. How do you manage your parking demand and make improvements to things like non-motorized transportation or transit or other kinds of investments. And then obviously public-private partnerships will be something that will continue to be really important as new development comes on board and those opportunities arise, that we can really leverage those investments to get more transportation improvements. So those are some funding sources that we have available today and are using today, just in different ways that we haven't necessarily considered the full range of what we might raise in terms of revenue from all those sources.
And one note I'd make about about the federal and state grants and potential stimulus and recovery funds as well. And I think we may have chatted about this at our last meeting. The way that this administration is indicating its priorities, both in terms of taking care of existing infrastructure, but then also focusing on sustainability and equity, very much aligns with the goals that you've set through Missoula Connect and the ways that projects have been prioritized. And so I feel like you will be in really good position to compete for some of those funds. And Aaron mentioned RAISE being the new name for BUILD. That is rebuilding American infrastructure with sustainability and equity. So it is putting sustainability and equity at the front of what is intended to be funded with those resources. So beyond those funding sources that are available or could become available, one of the things that we've done is take a look at sources of funding for transportation in other jurisdictions, in other states, and think about whether we want to acknowledge these impossibilities for the long range plan. One of the things that, I just want to be really transparent about, these are not, in most cases at least, these are not currently authorized by Montana state legislation, and they are heavy lifts. They are very heavy lifts to get approved in any location. But as we had a conversation with TTAC earlier in the month, committee members felt strongly that it made sense to include the fact that these are sources that other places are using, and wanted to get your input on that as well. So a handful of these. One of the challenges that states are facing, that the federal government is facing, of course, is that gas tax continues to be a declining revenue source. That is in part because it has not kept up with inflation. The purchasing power of the gas tax is far lower than it used to be. It is also about the fact that there are more electric and fuel efficient vehicles on the road. And so gas tax revenues continue to decline, and it is not a sustainable source of funding for transportation over the long term. So what many states are exploring, either on a pilot basis or even moving into something that is more permanent, is a vehicle miles traveled charge, or what's sometimes called a road usage charge. And so that is a tax that is often used as a replacement for the gas tax, that charges usually a few cents for every mile that is traveled. This is an example from Oregon, part of their pilot program. It's a little, I don't even know the right word for it. That little green thing is attached to the car, and then it is able to track the mileage that the car is driven. So that is an option that some places are using or starting to explore. There's also, of course, a local option sales tax that could be considered. This is legal in a few places in Montana and is very much tied to thinking about tourist or visitor taxes. And so that may be something that, again, I know that the Missoula area has been interested in this for a while, so that may be something that could be explored further in the future. You would want to, of course, if we're going to try and use those funds for transportation, be really clear about what it is that they're going to fund. Some states, Hawaii in particular, is one that uses a general excise tax. And so that is a tax on a wide variety of activities that happen in the state. So business services that are provided in the state. And that is something that is paid by anyone doing business in Hawaii. So for example, if I am working on a transportation planning project in Hawaii, Nelson Nygaard is paying a general excise tax. So that is a way to gather revenue from folks who are not even located within the state necessarily. An employee head tax and a large business payroll tax are a couple of sources that one has been used in the Seattle area previously, and the other has been explored. And an employee head tax essentially charges a fee for every employee that a business has. It can be applied to businesses of different sizes or across the board. A large business payroll tax is another approach that has been used. So, for example, people making over, for example, $100,000 a year, there would be a payroll tax that goes directly to the region that would be applied as part of this sort of approach. A local income tax is another source of funding that some municipalities are starting to explore. Again, as you might imagine, that one is a really heavy lift, but it is something that is part of the conversation around transportation funding nationally. There also are tolling or congestion pricing studies. There are fleet or vehicle pricing studies that are underway as well, to think about, maybe charging vehicles that impact our roadways more, an increment to help cover some of the maintenance costs. And then certainly, if gas tax does continue to be an option, the local fuel tax continues to be an option, you could look at some additional increments there. That is one that, while it is an important source of funding right now, again, is a source that we see declining. And so would encourage thinking very broadly about the sources of transportation funding that you might want to consider moving forward.
So Jennifer, I'll just jump in here. I would consider
Please.
all of these the cold day in hell options in Montana. Just to be honest, picking up a feather is a heavy lift for this legislature. So I guess we could include these in the document, but I don't see any of these having legs anytime soon.
Yeah.
Maybe I am
Dave,
grossly pessimistic, but others.
Dave, I'm really glad you said that. As I was listening to all this, I was trying to think of what the appropriate joke would be. Something like, oh, this would be great when we get back to the state capitol in Boston or something, or, this is fantastic for our friends in Northern California. But our state legislature is doing their darndest to undo the will of the voters in our county and city and repeal our local option fuel tax, which is the smallest of all these things. So this stuff is so pie in the sky unless we were to have some radical shift in polarization of, north becomes south, south becomes north, and all of a sudden Montana's a different type of state or something. These are great ideas, but absolute possibilities.
Jordan.
Yeah, I appreciate the comments from both commissioners. I think one thing is that, in my mind, is that Missoula County and the city of Missoula have a long history of being innovative and being responsive to the voters. And the local option fuel tax was a really good exhibit of that. And I think, as Commissioner Slotnick mentioned, it really is disenfranchising the will of the voters that's even up for repeal. I think, because of the fact that we have such a history of being aspirational and achieving our aspirations, I think these should go in the plan. I think they should remain in the written plan with a footnote that we've got a bit of a ball and chain from a legislature that has really a perverse view on local control, considering the ideologies that many members of that legislature purport to have around local control. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. But I think I commend you for coming up with some innovative options that might be realistic in a future environment.
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks, Josh, also. So next we have Mirta, then Debbie, and then Ryan.
I completely agree that our reality is grim at best when it comes to passing any sort of legislature that's going to allow us for more flexibility in terms of our funding resources. But I do agree with my fellow council member, Jordan, that we need to put this stuff out there and maybe one of them will stick at some point. And I think that we need to remain optimistic and do our homework in terms of seeing what's out there, what are other communities tapping into. If nothing else, this makes us look like we're idiots for not capitalizing on any of these potential resources. So that little bit of a in the head might be a good enough incentive for our legislature in the future. So I completely agree that first of all, I appreciate you looking into all of these possibilities and keeping them on the plan. Yep. Thanks.
Thanks, Merita. Debbie?
Dave, I largely just want to ditto Jordan and Merita's comments. I'm glad to have, had some discussion about these, and I wholeheartly want these in the plan. I don't want to lose sight of anything that might be an option to fund, some of these transportation items in the future. And I think it's good for us to check back in on these from time to time to see if one or any of these seem like a possibility. So I'd like to see them stay in the plan. Thanks.
Thanks, Ryan.
Right. I just wanted to chime in. I think maybe many of the folks involved already know this, but what we look at from a federal perspective when it comes to the LRTP is just what, in terms of fiscal constraint, we just want to see anything that's in there to help pay for the project list is quote unquote reasonable. And so including these types of things in the plan as possibilities doesn't hurt. We would just look to see that none of these things are being counted upon. Because Commissioner, as you said yourself, I mean, the likelihood of any of these things happening maybe isn't that great. And so we wouldn't want to rely on it to fund the project mix.
We are with you there. Commissioner Slotnick. Josh, are you?
Thanks, Dave. I had to untangle myself from mute and video, et cetera. Anyway, I'm glad that this is in the plan. I like the aspirational nature of it. I also like the broad view that we aren't attempting to think about things in a vacuum. We see that there are other states, other localities out there making use of these other tools. I just want to caution us all, and I think we should do it anyway, that this will come back to bite us at some point, where the same type of folks who are challenging our elections will also scream and yell that we are now advocating for a local income tax or some of the other things on this list that we put here under the heading of sources in other states. But I'm certain this will come back as proof of our badness. So this will not go unnoticed.
So maybe if nothing else, this could have the effect of reinforcing that of the array of options that are out there, maybe what is on the cusp of being nullified, it might not have been that bad after all. So
yeah, right.
So,
right. We could have picked one of these other ones that would have really made people mad.
It could be badder.
Yeah.
So Jennifer, I think you're getting the sentiment that we should retain all of this in the plan with a bit of a caveat, at least for those of us internally and some of our messaging, that these will be heavy lifts and require statutory change, at least among some of them. So.
Absolutely. And
Jennifer didn't know that Montana in 2021 bears a lot of resemblance to East Germany in 1972. They're very similar, actually.
I really appreciate just the openness about this as well. This is part of the reason that we wanted to daylight these as potential sources. When we include them in the plan in sort of a sidebar section that says, these are not things you can do right now, they are things that other states are doing. We recognize there's a risk in doing that, and TTAC members pointed that out as well. And so appreciate just the openness about what is likely not possible. The one of these that I do think will be interesting for us all to be tracking over the coming years is around the vehicle mile traveled or road usage charge, because there is federal conversation right now about this as a replacement for the gas tax. And states like Wyoming, Colorado, Hawaii, and others that have traditionally been much more conservative in terms of taxing than, for example, a state like Washington or a state like Oregon are thinking about piloting road usage charges as well. So you may actually have some company in that arena at some point in the future. But again, I am in agreement with you all that the lift for any of these is tremendous.
Jennifer, you might consider modifying that graphic, the little green chip. You could have an arrow to it that says Agenda 21. That might work. But
well, it's too large for a vaccine, Dave. So at least there's that.
All right. Continue on, Jennifer.
No, that's great. Aaron, was there anything that you wanted to add about these?
Only that, one of the reasons we're exploring these is not necessarily, we need to institute a whole broad range of new taxes and obviously there's unmet need in our transportation system. And I think there's always that trade-off of how much do we want to raise additional revenue versus just continue to have unmet need in our transportation system. But also just thinking about that things are going to change in the future, whether it's 5 years down the road or 10 or 20 years, that the gas tax is unlikely to continue to be the primary force behind our revenues over that amount of time. And so being prepared for those things, I think, is going to be helpful for us at a local level, and certainly at a state level, I think would be helpful as well. Just being able to anticipate and having ways to continue to fund transportation, because the need is not going to go away for people to get from one place to another, and we're still going to have to invest in infrastructure. So I guess that's the way I'm thinking about these, that we've got to pay for it, and these are some creative ways to start thinking about how we might do that.
Thanks.
All right, so where we go next then is, again, wrapping up the drafting of the plan. Our intent is to release that draft for public review at the end of the month. So April 30th is our target date. That will be available on the MPO's website. We'll be sending out social media posts, press release, and other ways to let people know that it's available. And then will be coming to TTAC and TPCC in May to describe the contents of the plan and help support your review as well. So that is what we're moving toward.
So Jennifer, one thing I just wanted to throw into the mix, and Mierta and Aaron and I have had some discussion about this, is whether in the spirit of contextualizing this plan and locating it in a specific place, might we want to include a land acknowledgement in here somewhere to recognize that this place is the Aboriginal homelands of the Salish and Kalispel people, and all that brings with it. And I'll open it up for discussion as far as what others think about that too. Anyone, any thoughts?
While folks are thinking about that or getting questions or comments, I will just say we certainly wouldn't be the first plan that would do that. I think there are, increasing number of plans that have that as a just sort of general, like you mentioned, just a general context of sort of the history of the Missoula Valley. And so I think in that sense, we wouldn't necessarily be groundbreaking. And I think it feels like that may be a trend that we're headed on for a lot of different plans, at least having that acknowledgement in there kind of upfront.
Mierta, do you have anything you want to add?
Just that I think it's timely, given the collaboration that we're trying to establish in our community and working together with our tribal communities. And so I think that this is an appropriate and timely place to do it. And I hope that you would support that. I'm enthusiastic about it. I think it shows commitment to that continued collaboration.
And as I guess a concrete example of how this might play out. So for instance, on Thursday, the city and county will be coming before the Transportation Commission proposing to name what is now the Higgins Avenue Bridge, Bear Tracks Bridge, which is something that came out of collaboration with CSKT and wanting to recognize the cultural importance of this specific place, and the fact that we currently have virtually zero, if any, major pieces of infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, among them recognizing the native peoples who've inhabited this place for millennia. So any other thoughts on that idea? Any other thoughts in general? Aaron, anything you want to say wrapping up this topic?
No. Well, maybe just to mention in terms of our public process moving forward. So as Jennifer mentioned, we'll have a public draft. We're shooting for having that ready by the end of next week, which puts us in line for meeting our 45-day review period. So between the end of next week and June's TPCC, we'll meet that 45-day period. So within that, there are a couple of dates that we need to get comments as early in that as possible to be able to make those changes and not be scrambling at midnight before TPCC to make edits to the long range plan. We're going to try to spare the Nelson Nygaard team that work. So I think what we're planning right now is to have 3 weeks of sort of open public comment where we're trying to gather all of that feedback and then have some refinements to the plans, make any changes we need to do so that we're ready for TTAC to have a kind of a final draft for TTAC, and then in the weeks between TTAC and TPCC make any of those last changes. But the caveat there is that we will take comments, I think, up until and through TPCC until you vote to adopt that plan. We can make changes, and so I don't want it to seem like we have this short comment period and then we won't accept anything after that. But just to try to be efficient in collecting our comments and moving the drafts along and being able to make those changes. Just the closer you get to adoption, as you all know, the harder it is to make changes in that time frame. So,
thanks, Aaron. And I know, Bob, you have to leave soon. We're going to transition into this next item in a minute here. If folks don't have more comments on the LRTP update in general, is there anything, Bob, that you wanted to get in before you need to split?
No, I'm good at this point, Dave. Thanks for asking.
Okay, thanks. Any final comments before we transition into air quality conformity?
would-
Okay.
Thank
Go-
you, Dave, for just want to offer a word of appreciation for this group. You all have been so instrumental in shaping the plan as we've gone through and have really appreciated the opportunity to get your feedback through all of this. So we'll take your direction today as well as the direction on adding an acknowledgement, and you'll see that in the draft plan here in a week and a half. So thank you all.
Thanks, Jennifer. Mierta?
I was just gonna thank Jennifer for and Aaron and everyone for keeping us updated, and exciting to see this being wrapped up and ready to be rolled out. And thank you.
Yeah, I would second that. Thank you. Okay, let's move into our next item. As I mentioned, this is the status of the long range transportation plan as it relates to air quality conformity. We received I received a letter from Ryan, and Ryan, I don't know if you want to speak to this also, but I'll let you, Aaron, and perhaps Ryan tag team this.
Yeah, well, I can give the quick overview. It's something that we knew was coming. The letter is largely a formality of announcing what we already knew, that our long range plan, because of our air quality issues or historic air quality issues in Missoula, we're required to do an update every 4 years. The 2016 plan was adopted. It was actually adopted in March of 2017, and the air quality conformity was approved on April 11th in 2017. And so our 4-year air quality conformity approval lapsed on April 11th, 2021. So basically what that means is we cannot amend our TIP. So the TIP amendments that we brought through last month were sort of the last TIP amendments until we get our new long range plan adopted and get that new air quality conformity approved. The good news is that we have a year of grace period between the lapse of our conformity and when I think more severe actions might be taken. And even beyond it, I think it's not uncommon for MPOs to go into a lapse. So in that sense, it's not a major issue, but we just want to be aware of that as we're moving forward, that we want to try to be as expeditious as possible in getting our new long range plan adopted and getting that new air quality conformity analysis done. And I think we're on a good target to do that, as we presented today, that we should be good to go to have that adopted in June, and then have our federal review and approval of that air quality analysis sometime by mid-July would be my hope, mid to end of July. So just wanted to give this committee an update that's where we're at. We do have a TIP. We were able to get a number of amendments through before this lapse. We anticipated it coming and had those amendments that we needed to get through in anticipation of that. So I think we're in reasonably good shape at this point.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Ryan, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I mean, I think Aaron hit all the same talking points I would have, other than just to reinforce that, yeah, for better or for worse, it's not an uncommon pattern. Each of your other peers in the state, when they did their last long range plan updates, went into a similar lapse period. I think you were strategic in the way that you got your TIP amendments presented and approved before the current conformity determination lapsed, and you are on track to update your plan, I would think, before there'd be any kind of on the ground impacts to your project. So again, I think Aaron hit all the right talking points.
Okay, so we don't need to go out to the woodshed quite yet. But,
No, again, it's I mean, I was in some of the conversations I've had with Aaron and others since, you know, I'd be curious to actually know what the national average is. I mean, how often in the long range plan update cycle there's some period of air quality conformity lapse. I mean, my hunch is that it's more often than not there's some period, just because, you know, best laid plans and all that, especially, you know, in the last year with COVID. And I think that you know, while this might not be written as such in the regs, I think we all agree that it's better to do a good long range plan than a quick long range plan. And so, you know, if that's the trade-off we are faced with, this is a better path to take. So, yeah.
Thanks. Okay. Any questions on that item? All right. Well, we have no old business today. Are there any announcements or other comments folks would like to make in general? Nothing, Don MacArthur? No? Okay.
Dave, I will
Aaron.
mention one that I think will be of interest to this committee, and we'll have some presentations for council tomorrow, but we are moving forward with the Higgins corridor plan, and so look for some updates on that project. So that's for the section from Brooks to Broadway of Higgins Avenue. We have some funding to do a corridor plan and really dial in what we want that section to look like, and tie into the new bridge improvements and some of the other work that's going on. And so excited to get that project up and running and get to work on what to do with that section of Higgins.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I can't believe it. We are going to be done a half an hour early today. So thanks everyone for your participation, and we will see you again next month. Thanks again, Jennifer, for all of your work and your team's work. And we will be adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.